Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking some of the most romanticized myths about global poverty and, well, shattering them with rigorous data. You know, we all carry around these deeply ingrained assumptions about how the poorest communities on Earth actually operate. But today, we're going to see what the hard numbers really have to say about the complex, everyday decisions people are making. Let's get into it.
So, think about this for a second. Do families always share their resources equally? Are people living in poverty just natural-born entrepreneurs waiting for a tiny loan to build an empire? We hear these ideas all the time, right? That families act as one big harmonious unit, or that a small microloan instantly transforms someone into a thriving business owner. Well, we're going to put those assumptions to the ultimate reality test. To get to the bottom of this, our explainer is going to hit three main areas. First, we'll look at the main economic findings, then the real-world impacts on populations, and finally, we'll do a critical analysis of the data itself. All right, let's kick things off with our first section, main economic findings, specifically deconstructing the household and microfinance.
Okay, so here's a crucial point. Families aren't usually acting as one perfect, united front. They're often literally fighting it out over resources. Economists have a term for this. It's called the non-unitary household. Basically, instead of a single, benevolent decision-maker perfectly splitting up resources for the good of the whole family, a household is really just a collection of individuals. Individuals with totally different preferences who are constantly bargaining with each other based on who holds the power. And realizing this, it completely changes how we have to design policy.
And we have data that brilliantly illustrates this. Who brings home the bacon fundamentally alters where that money actually goes. Take a look at pension eligibility in South Africa. Researchers found a massive divide. When grandmothers got pensions, they used that extra money to drastically improve the nutrition of their granddaughters. But when grandfathers received the exact same pension, there was literally no significant impact on childhood nutrition. Zero. So the identity of the earner completely dictates the outcome for the whole household.
To see this power struggle in action, we can look at farming in Burkina Faso. There, husbands and wives actually farm completely separate plots of land. Now, if this were a purely efficient, unified family, they'd obviously put the fertilizer exactly where it yields the most crops, right? But that's not what happens. Instead, almost all the fertilizer goes to the men's plots, while the women's plots are totally starved of inputs and labor. The family is literally choosing to be poorer overall just to maintain that internal balance of bargaining power. It's wild.
Moving on to credit. People in poverty actually borrow money quite frequently, but they face staggering, mind-boggling interest rates. We're talking 150% or more from informal moneylenders. You might wonder, why so high? Well, it's because traditional banks simply can't cover the huge fixed costs of monitoring and administering lots of really tiny loans. So they just exit the market entirely, and that leaves poor borrowers stuck with this incredibly expensive informal debt.
So microfinance steps in to try and solve this by totally restructuring the mechanics of lending. How? First, they use group liability, meaning peers basically insure each other's repayment. Second, they enforce standardized, super rigid weekly schedules, which drastically lowers administrative costs. And third, they use escalating loan sizes to build and incentivize future trust. It's a brilliant structural shift. It allows them to offer loans at way lower rates than those local moneylenders, all without going bankrupt themselves.
Moving right along to Section 2, real-world impacts on populations, or the human stakes of economic incentives. Let's look at Nobel laureate Amartya Sen's famous missing women calculation, because the data here reveals something truly disturbing. Biologically speaking, women actually survive better than men. That's why Europe sits at about a 1.05 ratio of women to men, and even impoverished sub-Saharan Africa, which tragically has the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, still maintains a normal biological ratio of 1.02. But then you look at a richer country like India, and it drops significantly, down to 0.94, meaning millions of women are just missing from the population.
Now, it's a tragic reality that economic development isn't just making this disparity magically disappear. In fact, as areas in China and India become wealthier, the gender ratio paradoxically gets worse. How does that make sense? Well, because wealth brings the ability to afford expensive pre-birth detection technologies, things like amniocentesis. So, shockingly, the richest parts of these countries very often have the fewest women.
To ground this heavy economic theory in visceral reality, listen to this devastating quote. "We haven't had a girl born in our village in the last 5 years." That was proudly stated by a village chief to a Chinese news agency.
It perfectly and tragically highlights the extreme outcomes of rationalized economic choices over human life. When the financial incentives heavily favor having boys, populations will use absolutely whatever means or technology is available to guarantee that outcome, even if it results in entire villages without a single girl.
But just as economics can incentivize tragedy, policy can actually mold politics for the better. Take Indian village councils, called panchayats. A lottery system forced certain villages to elect female leaders. Now, initially, male prejudice against women's competence was super high, but after a decade of being forced to experience female leadership through these reserved elections, male voters literally rewired their own perceptions. When asked to blindly rate political speeches, men in villages that had been reserved twice rated women's speeches far higher. Their objective judgment completely shifted.
Okay, let's jump into our final section, Section 3. Critical analysis of data. How economists separate correlation from causation. So let's look at the Spandana microfinance evaluation to see how researchers actually prove these things. They identified 104 eligible poor neighborhoods in Hyderabad. Then they randomly allowed a microfinance institution to enter only half of them, 52 neighborhoods, leaving the other 52 alone as a control group. By setting it up as a randomized controlled trial like this, researchers could finally peel back the curtain. They were able to isolate the true, unvarnished impact of microcredit over an 18-month period without any outside interference.
And the data they got back? It sparked massive industry backlash. Why? Because it proved, definitively, that microfinance is not a magical silver bullet. Yes, there was a small but significant increase in new businesses, but there was no massive leap in overall profits or revenues. And more importantly, there was absolutely zero change in child health, no increase in education spending, and no sudden empowerment in women's decision-making power within the household. The romanticized narrative everyone loved simply did not match the hard data.
Now let's look at another brilliant way data can isolate the truth. This is a natural experiment from China. Researchers looked at regions growing tea, which is traditionally picked by women, and compared them to areas growing orchard fruits, which are traditionally picked by men. Get this, when the global price of tea rose, the survival rates of baby girls in those specific regions spiked. But when the price of orchard fruit rose, boys were favored. The survival rates of children directly correlated to the rising market prices of the specific crops they would eventually grow up to harvest. It's unbelievable. What this data ultimately reveals is a pretty profound truth. People living in poverty aren't just passive victims blindly following deep-seated traditions. Not at all. They are highly rational actors, making incredibly complex, active choices about how to allocate their resources, all based on shifting financial incentives. I mean, think about it. When the economic value of a girl went up because of rising tea prices, that supposedly unbreakable tradition of favoring boys magically disappeared.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway. We've seen today that families constantly bargain for power, that microloans aren't magic wands, and that human survival can literally be tied to the price of tea. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. As rigorous data continues to unlock the real mechanics of human behavior and dismantle our most romanticized myths, how will you challenge your own assumptions? Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.